Funding for Firing Line is made possible by a major grant from the John M. Olin Foundation, Incorporated. Additional support is provided by the Mobile Corporation, Payne Weber, L. John Polite, Jr., the Friends of Firing Line, and by the financial support of viewers like you.
Welcome to Firing Line. I'm Michael Kinsley of the New Republic. The talk show host Larry King says that when the subject is abortion, the host never learns anything new. One goal of today's program is to prove him wrong. Mr. Buckley's guest is Laurence Tribe, Tyler Professor of Constitutional Law at Harvard, frequent practitioner before the Supreme Court, and a favorite source for reporters who need a quote from a liberal legal scholar. Mr. Tribe is the thinking man's Willie Horton. Republicans like to exploit the fear that a Democrat might appoint him to the Supreme Court someday. But Mr. Tribe's new book, called Abortion, the Clash of Absolutes, attempts a posture of sweet reason and moderation. Is there any principled way to split the difference between the value of human life, represented by the right to lifers, and the value of human freedom, represented by the pro-choice side? Mr. Tribe believes there is. The way to a principled compromise does not lie in moderate restrictions on abortion, which only frustrate the principles of both sides. Rather, he thinks, it lies in recognition that both sides share an interest in reducing the number of occasions when women find themselves pregnant against their wishes. That means two things. First, better and more available birth control so that fewer women have babies they don't want. And second, better postnatal health care, child care, parental leave, and so on, making it easier for pregnant women to want the babies they're going to have. Mr. Buckley, it's not so surprising that Larry Tribe's compromise on abortion turns out basically to be the liberal social agenda. But it seems to me he does present a tough challenge to right-to-lifers, such as yourself, who also, I presume, oppose early sex education, widespread birth control, and so on. If abortion is actually murder, isn't birth control and so on the lesser of the evils and therefore not merely okay, but possibly even morally required?
Oh, yeah. The moral code to which I subscribe distinguishes between a contraceptive and an abortifacient. And although, for instance, the Catholic Church discourages the use of the two, it nevertheless deplores with different severity something that kills a fetus and something that prevents a fetus from happening. The extent to which the people who are associated with the right to life movement also oppose certain kinds of sex education is that they think empirically, I think, for instance, of Professor Vanden Haag, that the net effect of that is to induce a hyperactivity where there was less of it before. And it's not, I think, uninteresting that in your own book you admit that 50% of the people who seek abortions were using contraceptives, so that maybe they were misused, or maybe the contraceptives are simply themselves too fallible. But that really is a pragmatic point, isn't it? We don't, you can't say with any assurance, can you, that if there was zero sex education taught today, there would be more abortions?
Well, I think it's terribly important to recognize that a number of young people are still quite ignorant about some very basic things. And even if they knew as much as we would hope they knew about avoiding pregnancy, the state of the art in contraception is nothing like what it might be in this country. We are decades behind a number of European countries in terms of effective and safe contraception. And so it's fairly clear that one area of common ground on which I would hope people could agree, regardless of how powerfully they feel the claims of fetal life or how powerfully they feel the claims of the woman, is the common ground that says preventing an unwanted pregnancy should come first. What's remarkable about the abortion debate, and perhaps one of the most fundamental reasons that it so often seems to get nowhere, isn't so much that both sides have flaws in their arguments, that both sides are as wrong as each accuses the other of being, It's really that both sides have so much in what they say that's right and that's true. And in the same way that Hegel talks about the difficult moral choices being choices between rights and not between right and wrong, one confronts that in this context, so that the fetus surely is alive. There's no doubt it's a member of the human species. Its very helplessness cries out for protection. And those on the pro-choice side who would attempt to deny that, I think, are denying something that they themselves, at a deep level, must feel. At the same time, I think it's awfully hard to deny that forcing a woman to remain pregnant against her will, to make a use of her body that she has come to find profoundly offensive to her, forcing her to become a mother, is a deep assault on her freedom and indeed on her equality. And so both sides have a great deal to say that is, I think, profoundly right.
But I think, if I may say so, that you, as also Mr. Kinsley, tend to load your terms. You say, for instance, profoundly offensive. Well, I'm sure it is profoundly offensive for a lot of people, but I think for some women it's simply trivially offensive. You can get an abortion before lunch, get back to work after lunch.
Well, it's rarely a lunch break activity. I mean, the point is, it's a serious.
Well, no, I think it's
making
serious.
someone say pregnant is.
I think it's serious. Nothing is just. You think it's serious, but I also think taking cocaine is serious, and yet a lot of people do it, and get over it and don't think of it as a major watershed of their life. And he used the term people who right to life over against people who believe in human freedom. Well, by definition, if you believe in human freedom and you also believe the fetus is a human, then you can't believe in human freedom if it includes the right to feticide, can you?
Well, it seems to me that posing it in terms of the right to life or the right to choice and trying to get leverage in terms of labels is part of what the problem has been. That is, there is an abundance of distrust on both sides that's poisoned the debate, so that typically someone who will call herself pro-life will say of groups that claim to be pro-choice that they are really licentious, pleasure-seeking, irresponsible baby killers. And equally, typically, a number of people who say that they're pro-choice will turn to advocates of protecting the fetus and will say that they are just hypocritical, small-minded woman haters.
Mm-hmm.
It seems to me that we don't get very far by structuring the debate that way.
But you're talking really about the polemic that's used, and I deplore it also and have written on the subject. But then, if I may say so, I think your book sets up a number of heuristic arguments, the tendency of all of which is to say there is no alternative pending the moment when no woman who wants an effective contraceptive can be without one, tends to simply perpetuate pro-choice. For instance, you say, why should you have parental consent? Since parental consent could be denied, in which case you have a division of responsibility, in which case, what do?
Well,
you
parental
go with
consent...
the parent, or you say you should have spousal consent. So you point out the fact that sometimes you can't even find the spouse. But aren't you really there setting up architectural arguments, the purpose of which is simply to enhance the your polemical insistence?
No,
that there is no alternative.
No, that isn't my purpose. I mean, take parental consent. That's one in which, although a considerable majority of the population describes itself as favoring choice by women, at the same time a majority will immediately say that they're in favor of some required consultation between a young girl and her parents before she can have an abortion. And in principle, I favor that kind of consultation, too. Mm-hmm. It seems to me that this is a fundamental and a difficult choice.
Provided comedy comes from it.
Well, provided that the communication is not so broken down that the legal requirement is just counterproductive.
Yes.
That is quite often, I mean, the quite tragic cases, a young woman named Spring Adams was shot by her father and killed when she consults with him and he learns that he's impregnated his daughter. The situations in which the law, the heavy hand of the law, is needed to create dialogue between parents and children are hardly the situations in which the threat of criminal punishment will be productive. And so that's why I think that parental consent requirements though they may be noble in their aspiration, are not likely to achieve any meaningful accommodation between the absolutes.
I don't deny that these are difficulties, and I think a very good analog is the debate, which is growing every day, on the question of under what circumstances can you end your life. All kinds of situations, some hypothetical, some actual, are adduced to show that if you lived another day, you'd be in agony of the day, and therefore the doctor should be perhaps allowed to kill you, as he's allowed to do in the Scandinavian countries, some of the low countries, and so forth. There you have, again, the same distinction at the other end of life showing up. All the complications involved in trying to, in effect, permit euthanasia. Now, you face the complications, but you have a technique of showing how much more complicated it would be if some of the objections of the lifers were countenanced. For instance, you say, they don't want their tax money to be used to abort children. Well, he didn't want his tax money to be used in Vietnam. And you say, well, this is simply the way democracy works. But don't you really miss the gravity of the situation there? War is not considered in our democracy organically evil, but genocide is by some degree. And if that's what you engaged in...
I thought the use of labels in order to elide the difficulty was something you wanted to avoid, and by calling it genocide, I do think that
I'm using the language of people who object very strongly to their tax dollars. They actually think that to the extent their tax dollars go to snuffing out lives, they are engaged in a form of feticide.
I do take that seriously, and I think that one solution that I suggest is a kind of tax checkoff solution. I mean, as with the presidential campaign, some might object to having their money used.
So 1% goes, otherwise cut it out, yeah.
That's right. So that I think people who do have that objection, as a matter of policy, perhaps should be allowed to opt out. And I don't think that there's necessarily a constitutional right here to public funding, but it seems to me that the compromise, which says women who are too poor to afford to terminate a pregnancy, even in cases of rape, must be relegated to the private marketplace, whereas other women have access to public funding, it seems to me that that's an unacceptable compromise.
Now, let me ask you a question which I hope you won't think is frivolous. A tremendous amount is made about the poor woman who, if she doesn't have publicly financed abortion, is going to go back to the coat hanger. We heard a lot about this during the Robert Bork proceedings. Now, if I'm correctly informed, abortions really aren't outside the reach of anybody, I was going to say this side of Tobacco Road, but probably even within Tobacco Road. In the first place, if you get somebody who's literally almost at the brink of starvation for lack of funds, you almost always would find a doctor who would abort free of charge, pro bono.
Well, the evidence does seem to indicate that the several $100s that it might cost, especially a rural teenager whose family is just scraping by, is a very significant obstacle. And I guess the question is, do we want to interpose that obstacle as a means of compromise? It doesn't sound to me as though it's an intelligent...
But Planned Parenthood has already advertised that in the event certain plebiscites go in a particular way, in Iowa and Missouri and whatever, they will raise money to transport people who want abortions to states in which they are legal.
And I think that is a possible solution. That is, I don't suggest that public funding is at the nub of the controversy. Yeah. It seems to me that, in general, the attempt to find some new midpoint, imposing, let's say, a line between what appear to be more justifiable abortions in cases of rape or incest and ones that strike the majority as less justifiable, is far less satisfying than the attempt to minimize the occasions of unwanted pregnancy, and precisely because the fetus, in the cases that are thought to be acceptable for abortion, even by many who favor the pro-life side, the fetus is every bit as innocent. The fetus, who was conceived as a result of a rape, hardly was to blame.
Yeah, I was going to talk about, I think you make that point with absolutely devastating clarity. What are the figures you cited? 80% okay if it's rape, right? And,
that's essentially right. And so the number of people who say this is a human being, a life...
Losing track of their own argument.
Losing track of their argument say that I'm prepared, of course, to make an exception if the circumstances under which the woman became pregnant were coercive. One of the things that does lead one to wonder, and I raise this question in the book, is whether those same people who will not make an exception in the event of a woman who tries conscientiously to use birth control, but then finds that against her best efforts she is pregnant, they won't make an exception in that case. Is that perhaps because they blame the woman simply for engaging in sexual activity? And is their pro-life position tinged with some underlying concern about giving men and women really the same range of options in society? I think that for many who are profoundly disturbed by abortion restrictions, the motive is a genuine compassion for the parties involved. For many who believe that abortion should be outlawed, the motive is a genuine compassion for the fetus. But for many, I think it's helpful to look into oneself and ask, why would I make this exception or that exception? Is it perhaps because I am less concerned with the absolute value that I claim on either side and more concerned with keeping women in their place, or more concerned with avoiding technological change?
Yeah, well, I think what you have demonstrated, or at least called attention to, is the adulteration of their principle. If you take the flat position as Henry Hyde does, that a fetus can't be molested with, then how it got to be a fetus becomes irrelevant. If you say, however, this is a fetus that was gotten as a result of a fun night out on the town, so goddamn it, certain restrictions apply on you that don't apply on this poor girl who was raped in the street corner.
Or on the man, who of course luckily doesn't have to confront the consequences. That the
yeah, but this is a natural legacy concerning which we really can't do very much, right?
Well, but the idea of transmuting nature into destiny, of transforming biology into social inevitability, that we can do something about. That is, it's not as though the natural circumstances under which some of us confront far graver consequences from our conduct than others must then be accepted by the law as a platform for all legislation of responsibility. I mean, it's quite easy to say, and that's of course what the Supreme Court required in Roe versus Wade, that the woman must, by law, be given certain options so that her own freedom can be made more meaningful. Let me go back to a point you made about the right to die, because it seems to me that there are going to be controversies that even those like Henry Hyde, who would make no exception for the case of rape, are going to be rather troubled by. That is, suppose you have a viable fetus, and suppose the only way to assure saving its life is to have a cesarean removal, to have surgical removal in a case, and this is often true, where that gravely threatens the life of the woman. Are we going to force surgery on the woman in those circumstances?
Well,
those are decisions
as you know, that was a theological problem in the Catholic Church, which wasn't really faced directly until the last part of the last century. Tubal pregnancies could not be aborted until relatively recently, even if the mother ran a risk. But the reformulation theologically doesn't strike me as slick. It says you can't go in with the intention of killing. So that if you go in with the intention of saving the mother, and the fetus is an accidental casualty of that effort, there's no mens rea.
Right, but I'm really not focusing on that problem so much as the problem in which the attempt, the intention to save the fetus requires forcibly submitting the woman to a surgical procedure which may endanger her life. It's not your purpose to kill her, and yet many who believe that we ought not to destroy the fetus would stop short of saying that we should force the woman to undergo surgery in order to save its life. Yet it turns out that in something like 1 out of 4 pregnancies, a cesarean section ends up being required. So suppose a woman says in mid-pregnancy, my medical situation is not now perilous, but if I remain pregnant, there's a significant chance that I'm going to have a surgical procedure which may be dangerous. That's my reason for an abortion. Now, someone who says that we ought not to allow the termination of a pregnancy except in extremis, except in cases of rape or immediate threat to the life of the woman, really has to rethink that position in light of these kinds of medical developments.
You get into the situation there of the right that the state has from time to time exercised to force the parents, for instance, to give certain medical care to children, even though to do so violates their own particular faith. It gets terribly tangled.
But they're not forced typically to give parts of their body to their children. I mean, no man, much as I
surrender
love my
one of
child,
his livers or whatever. Yeah.
I mean, the government can't tell me your child will die unless you allow a surgical procedure and transplant part of your kidney. Even though it would be good for me to be virtuous and altruistic in that way, the law tends not to demand that of me, and indeed doesn't demand it. And yet many would demand it of the woman, would say, you must give your body to that unborn.
Your objective then here really is simply to call attention to a weakness in the arguments of some pro-lifers who don't go to that length, although they should.
Well, it's really the other way around.
In fact, this isn't a very big public controversy here.
I think it's the other way around. It's less a matter of calling attention to the weaknesses of the arguments of both sides. It's a matter of trying to get each side to see the strengths of the arguments on the other, so that rather than engaging in a sort of a dialogue of who is more morally blind than whom, one can engage in a dialogue that recognizes that much as one hates to admit it, the other side has so much to say that's worth hearing, that we must put more energy, more resources in sex education, in infant care, in child care, in parental leave, in things that would make children welcome in the world.
That's a good point and a singular strength of your book. But I think that we have to recognize that especially shocking to the pro-lifers of the tendency to use abortion, for instance, because you're advised that it's going to be a girl and you want more boys.
I wonder, I've looked into whether there's any statistical evidence that happens.
I can't find it.
It seems to happen in India with some frequency. But there's no evidence that it's happened, for example, in Pennsylvania, where they made a big thing out of outlawing abortion for reasons of sex selection. You know, I suspect that the strategy behind laws of that kind is not so much to deal with a pressing social problem as to suggest, without evidence,
to dramatize
the so far as I know, non-existent problem of women having abortions because they want sons.
But we both know that there can't be a law written that's easier to evade than that one. You go to this doctor and he tells you it's going to be a girl, so you go to this doctor and say, I want an abortion, and you don't ask why.
Well, but I think the worst part about a law like that isn't how easy it is to evade, it's how easy it is to use as a basis for inquisition, in effect. That is, a woman seeks an abortion, and she is then subject, under a law like that in Pennsylvania, to cross-examination as to whether perhaps her real motive wasn't that she has some concern about the gender of the fetus.
Well, but is it or is it not properly the business of the state? This is not a loaded question. This is I'm being inquisitive. To inquire into the motives. To inquire into the motives of why people do things. For instance, we want to know why people become alcoholics, why they take cocaine, or so.
Oh, I think as a matter of sociological study, that's fine. But when
on the basis of certain findings, we now have a hate crimes law, right? Which I hope you opposed, but I'm afraid you probably didn't.
Which hate crimes law?
Oh, that you got to find out how many people did something because they hate Jews or hate blacks or hate Catholics or whatever.
Well, I mean, I don't oppose the study of these questions, but what I do oppose is making thought control the basis for restricting people's freedom. I certainly oppose that.
Well, we now have a whole criminal code aimed at people who are motivated by hate when they commit particular crimes.
Well, I have been troubled by that and have expressed some difficulty with it. But I think the point is, it's one thing for sociologists to study the various reasons that women have abortions. I would want to know more about that myself, because that would be one way of reducing the felt need for abortion.
Sure.
But it's quite another to say to a particular woman who says, I am desperate to end this pregnancy.
Even though
you won't let her do that. You won't let her do that until you've given her a lie detector test, until you've cross-examined the people with whom she has spent her time to find out how hard she tried to use contraception, whether she ever had amniocentesis, exactly what her habits and lifestyle might be. It seems to me that that's a profound intrusion on personal privacy.
Well, the way you describe it, and this is one of your gifts, it certainly would be. On the other hand, it seems to me that the collection of these data can help us formulate or can help us guide.
We're out of time. You want to finish your thought?
Well, I'm just saying that
a quick half hour.
The collection of data. For instance, we know that abortion is used in Japan simply as instrument of birth control. And we know the American people don't want that at all.
That's right.
Okay.
They want further. Sorry, go ahead.
Okay. Rather than answer that, I want to crack at Professor Tribe. You know, you bemoan the primitive state of contraception technology in this country, But really, the reason for that is liberal lawyers such as yourself who've created a regime of tort law that makes it impossible for any American drug company or any other American company to develop and sell birth control technology. So if this is so key to this moral compromise on abortion...
I didn't know you did that.
Shouldn't you rethink?
I didn't either.
In fact, think that position?
In fact, I'm working on a case in the Supreme Court that tries to put limits on tort liability, and I don't plead guilty to the proposition that it's liberal lawyers like myself who've created that
Well,
tort exclusion.
people like yourself, if not yourself. Surely it's
There's
true.
nobody like him.
Surely it's true that it is a regime. I mean, I went to Harvard Law School, and
I think
I
it
took
is
all these
partly
courses. It is a regime, the liberal legal regime in this country has created the tort explosion, which has in turn made contraception very
I don't know
difficult.
that the L word adds anything to this, but I did write an article about a decade ago called Too Much Law, Too Little Justice, and I have long believed that over-litigating and over-legalizing everything has had serious adverse social consequences. This may be one of them.
Well, if I understand the question, people are afraid to come up with more sophisticated forms of contraception because...
They're afraid of being sued.
Because
they're afraid that the side effects will lead to enormous punitive damages. And I think there is a serious problem with our attempt to provide so much compensation and deterrence that we discourage the underlying spirit of innovation. That's not the only problem, and I think it would be nice if we could solve the problem just by putting a cap on damages. I think that's only one small part of the solution.
But it's a part that you would welcome.
I would welcome that.
Thank you very much, Professor Laurence Tribe, author of Abortion, The Clash of Absolutes. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Kinsley.
Funding for Firing Line was made possible by a major grant from the John M. Olin Foundation, Incorporated. Additional support is provided by the Mobile Corporation, Payne Weber, L. John Polite, Jr., the Friends of Firing Line, and by the financial support of viewers like you.